My name is Nick, and thank you all for joining. This is the most registrants we've had for one of these webinars that we try to do every few months, just as something service that First Response Mental Health does. And so we're very thankful and happy to have Hayley Peek here as our keynote presenter and facilitator today, talking about how do we look after our peer supporters. A lot of you that are in attendance either are running peer support team as a coordinator, you may be on a peer support team, or I recognize some names that are looking to develop peer support programs. So Hayley helps groups kind of facilitate and get up and running and finding out who would be a good peer support. But the other half of that is making sure that those people are taken care of as they work to assist the rest of your department and members with their own mental health journeys. So Hayley is a mental health consultant who has had the pleasure of working with a variety of public and private sector organizations across Canada, delivering keynote presentations, educational workshops, and providing direct peer support program services. In addition, her passion inspired her to create a workshop entitled Supporting Through Struggle, which teaches people how to have meaningful conversations and support others during tough times. So Hayley will be going through this presentation. We will have time. We want to keep this to about an hour, but her presentation will be about 45 minutes. So we will have some time for discussion or questions later on. We have several First Response Mental Health staff members in the room here, particularly Kate, who helped to set up this webinar. So thank you, Kate, for that. And if you do have something in mind while we're going and do not want to interrupt, which would be appreciated, you can throw that in the chat and we'll keep track of those questions and hopefully spin around to them after or in a follow-up email with that email package that we are going to send to everyone. So I guess without further ado, we will pass it over to Hayley to deliver the presentation, and thank you all for your attendance.
All right, thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. So I do welcome you to, if you feel so inclined, you can turn your cameras on. It's always nice to see people's faces, but I completely respect if that does not feel like something you want to do right now, because sometimes we just need the break. Regardless, my name is Hayley, and today, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be walking through the realities of working in peer support and then some self-reflection on ways we can navigate burnout and boundaries, as well as self-care. And not in the run-of-the-mill traditional sense, I'm hoping, but in a more self-reflective way of looking at peer support. So as Nick mentioned, I wear a lot of different hats. I operate as a mental health consultant and as a speaker and as a peer supporter. Got into this as a result of my own living experience with mental health and mental health challenges. I am based out of Toronto, so I know we have folks from all over in this chat today, which is great. And something that is practiced here in Canada in terms of reconciliation is to do a quick land acknowledgement. I try and do this in a way that's not so performative, just to tick it off the list, but actually think about what I can do as a settler on these lands to support decolonization, support anti-oppressive lenses, and all of this work within mental health. So in Toronto, it's also known as Treaty 13, also known as the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And part of my ongoing intentional action in my personal and professional life is to try and continue to learn about how I might be contributing to oppressive colonial systems and how I can work towards that decolonization in our mental health care system, so both in Ontario and nationally. That's through person-centered language, supporting collective healing through storytelling, and supporting community care models as well. So just some of the ways we can look at that. Okay, we're going to jump right in because I have a feeling time is going to be tight and I do want to allow for space for questions. I have the chat open. If you want to pop in who you are, where you're coming from, just so other people can see, that's, I invite you to do that, or any comments as we go through or questions, I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so in the room, I know we've got folks that are already working in peer support, whether you're leading a team, whether you're providing one-to-one peer support directly, or maybe group peer support, or potentially looking at stepping into this role in your workplace. There are a lot of benefits, of course, to working in peer support. I'm going to make a big assumption that most of us are here because this is something that comes naturally to us, and because there are those natural inclinations to want to help other individuals who may be in struggle. So we all step into this role with the passion and desire to help others. It is a unique role with unique skills that are required to be able to support another in struggle, because that word struggle is a big spectrum when we're talking mental health and wellness. Some of the benefits of working in peer support, which I know these will be review for many of you, but it does fuel that sense of purpose and passion. I know for me, that's one of the reasons I got into it, wanting to give back, wanting to support. There was a genuine passion to be in a field that supported others from a place that was non-clinical and really from that human to human connection. It's also something that creates hope and can build empowerment. So creates hope not only for ourselves, as we are also on a path of recovery and healing, but creates hope for others who may truly be in a space of hopelessness. And the empowerment is both sides as well. You know, we're working with peers to empower them in their livelihoods, their quality of life, their decision making. But for us, in terms of turning something that may have been a very difficult challenge or difficult piece of our lives and experiences, turning that into something that can support another, there is empowerment in that. At least I feel that way. Provides connection to community. So in the larger sense, it could be community in your workplaces, just getting to know other staff, maybe in ways that you wouldn't have before, but also connection to community because we're all relating from that place of living experience to one degree or another. We're there supporting others through challenge as best as we can to the best of our ability. And it's also the benefit being it supports personal healing. So there is a bit of a selfishness even to being a peer supporter. I know for me, I've had moments where it feels really good for me to know I'm there for someone else and they're feeling that, they're feeling like this is helpful. That in turn feels good for me and I know supports my well-being in the long run. So I know these aren't new, but what we sometimes don't create a lot of space to talk about are the challenges that are also associated with being a peer supporter, because there are many, just like any other role, any other job. This is a very specific set of skills that takes energy from us in ways we're not giving on a day-to-day basis. It requires a lot of emotional energy. It doesn't mean every conversation is very heavy and in depth, but even the ones that might feel lighter, there's still a give from our energy point of view that, you know, we're not doing in our day-to-day autopilot interactions. Sometimes what can happen is we might jump into these roles and easily lose track of our own well-being and self-care practices, especially if we're in a space that feels regulated, we feel good, we feel strong. That's great. We have a toolbox that maybe we pull on things here and there. But what can happen is we kind of coast through and maybe things start to fall off the radar, and then we take a bit of a dip and we're not feeling as strong as we used to. So it's really important for us to see how this work is impacting us, both positively, but also potentially in ways that might be somewhat harmful or having a harmful impact on our well-being. Okay, so we're going to start with some of the challenges of being a peer supporter. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are 6 I wanted to highlight, I think, from a category point of view for to give us some conversation around it. So I've separated these into personal challenges and structural. Some may touch on both, but for the sake of today, we're going to go with it like this. So in the personal set of challenges that can arise, emotional impact, empathetic strain. This is probably one of the top ones we see. Like I said, we're constantly giving a lot of our energy to the peers that we are supporting. We are sometimes leaning into spaces that we haven't leaned into for a while emotionally, and that can take away. Empathetic strain, this can also be known as compassion fatigue. I just find empathetic strain more of a accurate description, I think, of that. When we're constantly showing up for others and empathizing with their emotions, and because empathy is about the emotions and not necessarily the experiences, that can start to erode our ability to respond in compassion. And it can start to erode our ability to tolerate strong emotions, right? Or difficult stories, exposure to these stories and people's experiences. This can look like being in a state of physical or even emotional exhaustion that can reduce our ability to empathize with or care for others or show up for them in conversation. The second one is closely tied, those personal triggers and impact on well-being. As peer supporters, we can't always guarantee what the conversation will bring. We don't know what people are coming to the table with. We're not sure what they're going to choose to disclose to us or not. So sometimes engaging in those conversations, we might feel hit by something in a way that we didn't expect to. So someone could share an experience that ends up being quite close to home, and maybe it touches on something deep down we didn't know was there, or we knew was there and we didn't realize we still had some work to do around that. So personal triggers, personal points of distress are very real, and they can have an impact on our well-being. The confidence and skill set, I think, is interesting. We hopefully, as we step into peer support roles, we've taken some training, we've taken a peer support training among other psychoeducational trainings, and we're stepping in feeling like we have that foundation to support and show up. And what I see time and time again, including for myself, is when we're meeting more and more individuals, you'll get into conversations that you feel maybe you're questioning your confidence, you're questioning that skill set and feeling ill-equipped depending on what's being put on the table in front of you. Sometimes we feel more equipped to support in one situation versus another, and this is where stigma can also play a role too. But it is very common, no matter how long you've been doing peer support, that this comes up at some point or another, where we start to think, am I doing a good job? Am I even offering them something that's useful? It's very normal. So I want to validate that for anyone who's experienced that before. In terms of the structural, workload and demand, that could be both personal and structural in the context of our workplace settings. So it could be that potentially we're doing peer support as an addition to our full-time role. It could be something that's happening off the side of the desk. It could be that we've also taken on too many peers. So that would be a personal impact. It can cross both sides. There's also the lack of resources and support. This can be real if we're feeling like we're operating in a silo potentially, if maybe you're part of a larger peer support team, so you have that community of practice to engage with and kind of bounce ideas around, while respecting confidentiality, of course, and know what resources are out there outside of the workplace. Maybe you need to connect a peer to community resource, but just feeling that is a big part of being part of a community of practice. And then navigating role ambiguity. We're going to touch on this in a little deeper in a couple slides, but if we don't have clear parameters of what this role is meant to look like for us, that can be very draining, because potentially we're giving too much outside of the scope of work, or just trying to understand it can be mentally exhausting and emotionally exhausting. All right. The little quote there on the side, those are just my words, but I wanted to highlight it here. There is definitely a false expectation that once you're a peer supporter, you should always be able to provide support to another, no matter what. The reality is, as peer supporters, we ebb and flow in our capacity to be a peer supporter. That's because we also need to be mindful of our own well-being. So it's very common for folks to go in and out of being able to offer that one-to-one support. That's something I've faced over the years, absolutely, a few times over, where I've had to take that step back to focus on my well-being, instead of trying to push through and show up for all of my peers, even when I know it's causing me damage. So we are also on our own path of recovery or healing in some way or another. And that's the reason that there may be moments where it feels like too much and harmful to show up and be in this role. And other times it might feel really great and a huge part of your own recovery. Okay. We're not going to do a wildly deep dive on burnout. I think over the years, we've probably heard a lot about it. But in terms of burnout in the context of peer support, this is a quote from Stephen Kohler. He's an author and journalist. He wrote an article a couple of years back, but just to set the tone of what burnout can be in his words, this is not a be-all and end-all definition, but he speaks to it as being identified by three symptoms: exhaustion, depression, and cynicism. He says it's the byproduct of repeated and prolonged stress, not the result of working long hours, but rather the result of working long hours under specific conditions. So that could be high risk, a lack of sense of control, a misalignment of passion and purpose, and long and uncertain gaps between effort and reward. And so when I read this, I almost interpreted it as a peer supporter, we could experience burnout potentially through being in high risk situations or being in situations that take a lot of energy and potentially low reward. And I'm going to explain that a little further as we go along. There are lots of things that can identify burnout. Again, not an exhaustive list. It's so unique to us. And there are so many contributing factors, cognitive, physical, emotional, lots of realities. These are just some of the ones I wanted to highlight. Hopefully for a sense of validation too, because I think burnout, we've heard so much over the last few years. It can feel, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say stigmatizing, but it can feel tough to identify that we may be a bit burnt out because we want to power through, we want to show up, we think everybody else is doing it, I should be able to do it, but that's actually not serving us whatsoever. And so this measuring ourselves against societal expectations can also contribute to burnout. So I just highlighted a few here. Could be physical, physical aches and pains, could be physical illness. It could be that chronic fatigue, exhaustion. Also, boundary issues can lead to burnout, and we will touch on boundaries briefly. If you're feeling a sense of hopelessness in this role, that could be a sign of burnout or a lack of being able to empathize with others. So I'll just leave that there for some food for thought for us. But again, there are many, many more that could be added here. Okay, so we know peer support has its benefits. We know it comes with challenges. We've started to look at these. What do we do about that? How do we continue to be in this role if it's what we want to be doing, recognizing the realities that come with that, while also sustaining our self-care and well-being? And I'm still to this day trying to find a new word for self-care because it's almost lost its meaning at this point. I feel like it's been overused too much. So if you have one, please throw it in the chat. So I like to look at it as proactive self-care. For me, that's really helpful. We can be very reactive with caring for ourselves. We kind of wait until we're in that space of, if you've ever seen the mental health continuum, we're in that space of orange to red where we are unwell and no longer coping. And then you hit that rock bottom and we have to put things in place. So if we can slowly practice being proactive with it and keeping our regular routines in place as best we can. Not every day is going to be a win, but also starting to notice our tiny flags when they show up that maybe we need to pay a little bit more attention to something. So when I think proactive, that's what I'm referring to. I'm also just reading the chat, so that's great that you guys are engaging. I appreciate that. Okay, so I thought this would be a somewhat interesting exercise, and I know that we can't be too interactive here, but again, the chat's there. This is something I've used over the years when doing peer support. So these are questions I have found myself reflecting on, and it took me time to even honor that these could be questions because there was a sense of shame and guilt that potentially came along with even thinking I was being impacted by being a peer supporter. So I'll walk us through these. The point here is to look at these and reflect on what might the level of impact of the following questions have on you, because this could be indicators of burnout. It could be indicators of boundaries might be needed. It could be indicators of a lot of things. So the first one is in relation to cumulative stress. A question that I have found myself asking, and one that we can use, is sitting back and thinking, are the number of individuals or peers I'm supporting negatively impacting me? Is your caseload of peers too many? Are you trying to support 10 people all at the same time, as well as doing your job? Or what does that number look like for you? So when I started in peer support, this was really, really key for me to figure out what felt like a manageable number of individuals to show up for. And I learned that the hard way. I definitely did. But when I learned it and was able to communicate that for a need, it made a huge difference in my ability to be a peer supporter. Definitely reduced long-term stress. It reduced meeting some wild expectation that either I probably had set for myself or maybe I felt was set for me. So this is a really good question to just start off with. I call it me time. Yes, thanks, John. Love it. Empathetic strain or gut compassion fatigue, as it's commonly referred to, this could look like asking yourself, do I still even enjoy being a peer supporter? Maybe you stepped into this and you were really, really excited, really looking forward to it. And as we get into the role, it's not landing in as we hoped it would. And that is very okay. I run peer support trainings all the time where, we have 3-day intensives. And then at the end, people are feeling not ready to give that much of themselves. And that's great self-awareness, but also very, very okay. So to ask yourself that question is really important. Do I even still enjoy this work? Because if you don't, and this isn't what you want to be doing with your time, that's important to acknowledge and honor. Because the last thing we want to do is be showing up in our peer relationships from a place of disconnection or lack of passion to the work. So there's no shame in asking, reevaluating that every few months or every year, whatever feels good to you. Triggering or distress. Triggering is definitely the common term. That's why I've put it up there. But a question we can look at is in your peer conversations, in your interactions, which all look different, are you sharing parts of yourself or your story, your experience that actually don't feel good to share? So there are occasions where we might be in a peer conversation and someone mentions something, maybe it brings up a memory for us and we can relate from that directly and we want to share it because we want them to feel less alone. But maybe it's actually not healthy for us to share it for whatever the reasons are. For me, this was something I wasn't aware of. In the first few years of doing this work, I never really spoke in depth to my experience with suicidality. I don't know why, it just probably still had some my own feels around that. So I did not disclose that part of myself with individuals if it would come up or if they asked me. In more recent years, I've done the work to be able to speak to it, but that was something that really stood out where it never felt good for me to speak to it in the early years of doing this work. So this is a really important question to ask because just because you have a ton of experience doesn't mean you're expected to share it all, right? This has to feel good and helpful for each one of us, and that's going to look different across the board. And it may change over the years too. Distress and vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma also can be called secondary trauma. And I know almost all of you are probably in frontline work, but vicarious trauma can coexist with direct trauma. And this could be simply through supporting others through what they might have as traumatic experiences. So the question is, am I supporting any peers whose experiences are actually causing me unintentional harm? Over the pandemic, I worked quite closely with a lot of shelter workers. And although not your typical frontline workers in the traditional sense, the exposure to the things they were seeing on a day-to-day basis with their residents was causing a lot of vicarious trauma for them, and they did not even know that was a thing. So them not even being aware that that could be an impact actually led to more burnout. And when we validated that this is a real vicarious trauma is very real, it helped alleviate that weight on some of them. So even just being able to name something for what it is can help with that weight. But again, this goes back to what you want to share. You don't have to be a peer supporter that shows up for anything and everything. That's really important to do a self-check on. And that, again, might change over time. There might be moments where you're like, I'm ready to support whatever shows up. And there might be moments where you're feeling, you know what, I'm not in my strongest. This is feeling a bit too much for me. Maybe I need to transfer this peer or whatever the case is. Emotional and mental exhaustion. Am I showing up to all my peer relationships equally? Or are there ones that I'm beginning to dread, resent, lose patience with? I know there are relationships with peers that sometimes we feel away if we're not seeing that progress, if we're not seeing that, like, even if it's the smallest bit of progress, that can really, really drain us. It's hard to meet someone where they're at for a long period of time if you're not seeing that shift. It's a question to ask because if we stay in those relationships for a long period of time and feel that way, we're probably not as present. We're probably not as empathetic or as non-judgmental. And again, it's okay if that happens. You're human. Maybe a transfer of a new peer supporter is required. The last one here is to do with personal well-being. So Some reflection questions could be, am I still practicing my own forms of self-care? We've talked about that. Or do I maybe need more tools or supports? Maybe what you've been doing for 5 years is no longer having the same supportive impact it used to. I know I experienced that a few years back, where all of the tools I had that have served me so well for many years just kind of stopped working. And that was hard because I had to reevaluate, what do I do now? Something had shifted in my own well-being that needed to be readdressed. So this is also very real. All right, I better speed up. I know time is ticking away. Okay. So on the structural side of things, if we're looking at our peer support programs and structural impact, this could be consideration points for anyone creating a team, leading a team, discussing your team dynamics. In terms of workload and demand, again, a bit on the personal side too, but that question of, am I taking on too many peers to meet role expectations? So are we overloaded with the people we're supporting and not giving our full selves in each of those relationships? Or am I feeling overwhelmed trying to be a peer supporter on top of my job responsibilities? Is this something you're doing off the side of your desk and it's feeling like too much to do on top of your deliverables that are expected of you day in and day out? Or, being in the field all day, responding to calls, and then having to do this as well. It might be too straining. That's very individual for us to determine. Resources and support. Am I feeling confident and equipped in my skill set to be a peer supporter? Maybe you took initial training, but again, as we're exposed to more conversations and meeting new people, new things come up and the learning is never ending. Like, we can do deep dives into so many of these things. And, if we had 3 days together, I could do 10 different workshops with you, but it's important to note where we feel like we might want a bit of a deeper understanding, or emphasizing some skill sets, right? It's very normal for these things to show up and want to grow. The other piece too is if we're feeling isolated in this role. If you have a team, it's fantastic, right? Leaning on that team can really help with feeling siloed or isolated. I know there are peer supporters that work in hospital, for instance, where they might be the only one on their team. And that can be really hard when you're surrounded by people that don't do this work and they don't understand what it entails. And then with the role ambiguity, it could be asking ourselves, am I clear on the expectations of what being a peer supporter are, right? We're not expected to be crisis workers or mental health workers. What is that line? What does it look like? Being really clear on that, whether you're creating a program or, communicating with your team what this looks like, maybe it needs to be better defined. That could be an option. Also, is it a conflict of interest to support direct team members or staff? This is something that might look different across the board. It can be potentially a conflict because if we go back to the peer support principles, minimizing that power dynamic is really important to create that human to human connection, right? We're peers on equal level, equal footing. So if you're a supervisor trying to also support your staff, potentially wearing your peer support hat, that might create a power dynamic for them that maybe needs to be discussed. So just some things to reflect on. So I'm going to briefly touch on boundaries. Again, this could be a whole workshop in itself that I can do, but for the purpose of today, I think it's important to just acknowledge that boundaries are really critical in peer support work. They're also very hard. I think in personal and professional lives, we have a hard time setting boundaries because they can feel uncomfortable, they can feel awkward, they can feel selfish. All of these things are real. Two ways to look at them. So on the personal side, personal boundaries reflect limits or rules we might set for ourselves within relationships, within our interpersonal relationships, to protect our well-being and integrity. Some of us may already have boundaries, we just don't label them as such. And some of us may have none and think, ooh, I need to protect my energy or protect my well-being, and maybe put some in place. They help define our identity, they help define our values and our personal space. So this is really important so that we're not building resentment, we're not building burnout in our relationships. And we're not always given the space to even reflect on this or ask ourselves these questions. So I wanted to bring it forward here. On the other side, we have professional boundaries. If you are part of a formal peer support program in your workplace, there may be a code of conduct that you have in place. There may be policies, more rigid rules around what this looks like because you're in a workplace setting. So these are guidelines and rules that define appropriate interactions in a work or support context. So they're meant to ensure safety, creating a safe environment, respectful environment, ethical environment. Both personal and professional boundaries keep us grounded in our peer support values. They're really, really key when we're doing this work. We are interacting with people day in and day out, and without them, the lines can get blurred. Our emotions can end up getting very triggered for different reasons. We might experience peer drift. We might end up, being more of a friend than a peer supporter. So boundaries are really, really key to keep it grounded in what peer support is about. So how do we go about identifying them? This can be tough. And again, these are, I've only got 5 examples here. This is a much larger discussion. But for you, we can start to reflect on what boundaries we might have already or need to create to ensure that we can continue to show up in this capacity in our role as peer supporters. And boundaries can be related to physical boundaries, right? Maybe you're not a hugger. I always go to that one. It's the most common one. Half of us are huggers, half of us are not. This is really important, especially post-pandemic. This has become much more apparent in asking for consent prior to giving someone a hug. So physical is a reality. Emotional boundaries. These ones can be a bit tougher to identify sometimes, especially if we're not fully aware of our trigger points or the things that might be deep down still that we're still working on. They also help get identified through self-awareness practice too, the more we learn about ourselves and how we're showing up in the world. Time, energy, mental or intellectual. For that one, it's often the easiest example is if for people could be a boundary of not engaging in conversation with certain individuals around religion or politics if there's no space to hear each other and agree to disagree in a kind way. I think we can all picture that person we may not have these conversations with, but that's what mental intellectual means. And then professional. So just briefly looking at these 5 examples, one could be in the context of peer support. Are there specific topics or situations that I find too emotionally draining to support someone through? That's going to look unique. Again, you're not expected to be a peer supporter for anything and everything all the time. If you can be, amazing, that's great, but it's not expected. I have ebbed and flowed through being able to support through certain things and not others, and then supporting through everything. It changes all the time. So that is something to really keep a beat on as we're interacting with our colleagues and our peers, to notice with what's being shared with us and how it's landing in. And is it staying with us after the fact? Like, what is that impact? It might have an impact, but it feels manageable, and it may not, and we need to pay attention. Another boundary reflection question could be, do I need to adjust how much time I'm actually dedicating to being a peer supporter to ensure my own well-being? Again, across the programs, this could look different in terms of role expectations, but this is something that could be part of the larger conversation of how frequently you're making yourself available in those conversations. Or if you're with a peer, how frequently you're making yourself available to them, right? Is it just during work hours or your shift hours? Are you ending up in situations where they're calling you all the time outside of these hours? Is it impeding on your personal time? All things to be considered. What interactions deplete your energy and which ones actually replenish it? Am I advocating for myself to ensure my boundaries are clear and respected by others? To go back to what I said earlier, boundaries can feel tough. Sometimes we feel like we don't have a right to set them, but we do. And advocating for that is really important, especially in a role like this. Doesn't mean we're setting them from a place of passive aggressiveness or anything like that, or confrontation. We're setting them from a place of kindness and compassion because we need to protect our own well-being. You're also role modeling that to your peers, that it's okay to have boundaries, right? Because your peers may have some boundaries too that we need to honor as their supporter. So this goes both ways. So doing this work as a peer supporter is a great opportunity to role model that self-advocacy, that empowerment, that self-determination for your peers who may be starting out in their own journey and trying to reclaim, their choices and their voice and their autonomy. So it's really important. And then the last one I have here as an example is, have I considered even setting boundaries before as a peer supporter? Is this something that has even come up? Maybe it came up in a training you took, or maybe this is a whole new topic of conversation for you, but it is very important. And as peer supporters, you are allowed to have the boundaries that you need and honor what that looks like. And again, it's going to look different across each and every one of us. So it's not always a conversation we're making space for and having, but I wanted to bring it forward here. Identifying is one thing, and boundaries are going to change. They might look different in each peer relationship, and they might look different month after month, day after day. There's no perfect recipe. There's no checklist of here's how it works, set one and done. Nothing in peer support, I think, looks like that. And if you're in the role and doing the role, I think that's maybe become apparent. There's no one size fits all. So when we look at setting boundaries, communication is key. We can set boundaries in a way that is respectful, in a way that is kind, in a way that's compassionate. All these foundational skill sets that we use in our relationships, we can use when setting boundaries. A couple suggestions are to communicate assertively, right? Using those I statements, so we're making it about our needs and not about controlling the other person and what they're doing. That's not what boundaries are for. Language can be very important. Words matter, they do. So maintaining that compassionate and empathetic demeanor, but delivering it directly, there's a way that those two things can coexist, and that, if you need to practice it beforehand, go ahead and practice it, right? But paying attention to the delivery of it while also being direct. Timing. We want to avoid setting boundaries in highly reactive moments, unless this is, of course, a crisis situation and you need to step away for safety. But we're maybe not having this discussion if we're highly reactive or the peer is highly reactive for whatever reason. You kind of want to find that neutral time as best you can if that's available. And then flexibility. Consider if the boundary that you potentially have already or are setting or have set for the last 6 months, is it still serving you? Is it too rigid? Does it need to be adjusted? Like I said, they are going to change over time and they're going to look different in each relationship. I know I've had peer relationships where some are very boundaried because I know if I don't have those, I will get taken advantage of or end up drained or resentful. And I have others that the boundaries are looser because I know that person can respect my time and energy as well. Like you feel that out with your peers. I think that develops naturally, or sometimes we're learning the hard way. That also happens. But just reflecting on if it's still serving you, just because you've had it before, doesn't mean you have to stick to it if it's no longer working, right? And having that community of practice with your team, this is something maybe you chat about as your peer team, looking at this in deeper conversation. And if you're worried about professional boundaries specifically, have that conversation with your peer support lead. If you're thinking, is this still in the confines of the role? Am I encroaching on a code of conduct? I'm also their friend, so can I be their peer supporter? It's hard to know which hat to wear. Ask those questions. Who can you go to have those discussions? Because all of this should not just fall on the individual as we operate in this role. It's really important to have these debriefs with our team or with our lead where possible. The last piece I want to mention, and I wasn't originally going to, but I thought it's a good topic of conversation to maybe plant a seed and leave you guys with. As peer supporters, again, we're all here because of our own living experience in whatever capacity that is. That could be with mental health challenge, it could be with illness, it could be with substance use, it could be with addiction, suicidality, whatever. It could be life experience, right? We are on our own journey, path of recovery, healing, however you want to phrase it. We're also in this route of constantly growing personal growth, self-awareness. And we are going to ebb and flow between coping and healing. I'm bringing this forward because coping and healing are two distinct but connected processes when it comes to our recovery journey. This made a big difference for me a couple of years ago when I started to frame it this way, especially when it came to feeling like I was failing as a peer supporter, because I thought, I'm 6 years in, I should be, I'm well, I should be able to do all this. Why am I triggered? Why am I drained? This gave me permission to be a human. So I'm bringing it to you all. Hopefully it might feel a bit validating, but Coping, it's a word I'm sure many of us are familiar with. These two things can coexist. They can be separate, but also coexist. So both support daily functioning in a way, but coping specifically is about strategies or behaviors used to manage typically immediate or short-term impact of stress, mental health challenge, addiction, trauma. Um, Coping strategies support our daily functioning while also trying to manage the stressor. It's still present, right? It's still there to a degree. So our bodies may even still feel under threat depending on what that stressor is. And coping mechanisms can be that first step towards healing, and healing in the sense of long term. Coping strategies can also be healthy, or known as adaptive, and some can be considered maybe unhealthy or maladaptive. Um, that's important to note because with coping specifically, sometimes it gets a negative connotation attached to it. But I think it's important to acknowledge that if we're in a space with some of our experience we're still working through and we still have coping strategies in place, that's okay, like meeting ourselves where we're at, but also starting to check in on, has this coping strategy become more of a long-term habit now and is no longer serving in the way it originally was, and maybe has become a little more harmful and patterned. I'm just going to plant that seed. With healing in the sense of this is a deeper, more holistic approach to addressing our, whether it's core wounds, trauma, mental health challenges, addiction realities. Healing is that longevity route we're trying to get to. So coping helps us to a degree and can even give us, start to wedge those small gaps that push us into healing more with certain things. The ideal is that we're not just masking and dealing with in the moment and the stressor is still there. The ideal is that we're eventually moving to spaces with each stressor where the impact of the stressor is less. And that can be a sign that you're moving into a space of healing, which then in turn may change what you're willing to bring to your peer relationships, because it feels like it's supporting that level of healing. The healing, of course, too, speaks to building that building personal resilience, moving into our fear and out of like our comfort zone into fear and discomfort to push through to that growth zone. This is a long-term thing. This does not happen overnight. But the ideal is that we're moving into a space that might reduce or eliminate our symptoms, potentially triggers, things like that. I'd love to have longer discussion on this concept in general, and I know we don't have time for it, but I did want to bring it forward today as some food for thought as you move into your reflection part of what peer support looks like for you right now and what are the impact of all these different things we've touched on today. So I know I've thrown probably a lot of information at you in a short amount of time. You will have a copy of the recording, but I thought it would be a good opportunity as well to leave, the 15 minutes to open it up. If there are any comments or questions or points of confusion or pushback, any of that is all welcomed. So maybe I'll pass it back over to you, Nick, to allow for that space.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hayley. That was really good. And while you're thinking of or writing questions in the chat, I would encourage you, you've got Hayley's contact information there. We'll put it in the follow-up, but I could see how this presentation, I know a lot of people on the call right now are team coordinators, but if you want this presentation, I'm pitching for you, Hayley. I'm assuming this is okay. If you want this presentation for your whole peer team, I think that'd be really valuable. And so definitely connect with Hayley after this to maybe set that up. We just have
Yeah, I'll just
go ahead.
acknowledge too, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'm very conscious that there's a lot of things that have been mentioned here that do require their own, workshop. These topics can feel very overwhelming and large in discussion. So I definitely want to bring forward some things to plant some seeds, but just also acknowledge that many of these need deeper conversation.
Definitely. So I guess one of the questions was along those lines, can I share this with my peer advisors? Or what parts would you actually suggest would be kind of the most important or key takeaways maybe that could be shared?
Yeah, I think if you're sharing with peer advisors, I think the looking at your your peer support team dynamics, in terms of especially role expectations and boundaries and capacity is really important. And also that sense of debriefing with each other. We really want to have that space because some of these conversations can feel quite heavy. And as peer supporters, none of us should be expected to carry the weight of some of these being more intense alone or make decisions alone if we're dealing with extremes and there's a level of safety at risk. Of course, respecting confidentiality at the same time, but the debriefing has been huge in terms of sustaining peer support and well-being. So we don't feel like we're carrying it all.
Leo, you have your hand up.
Hey, Haley. Hey, everybody. Thank you for today. This was really great. My question is, are there any peer support links or ideas that you have for those of us who are retiring or retired? A lot of us, myself, long-term addiction, long-term recovery. But if I'm alone, I'm isolated with all my stuff, we don't retire very well. And what is the value of maybe somebody 10, 15 years before they get towards retirement, having peer support come in and maybe do a presentation on whatever links you have to help them out. Hey, thanks for today. It was really great.
Thanks, Leo. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd have to give it some more thought in terms of that's a unique situation, right? Where do we go to when we're retired and no longer part of that community, but this still impacts us? I can't say offhand. I know exactly what those links would be. I'd have to give it some thought if I'm being upfront. I know there's communities of practices that exist that I believe would still be open to folks, even if you're not in a formal peer support position. But I don't have them off the top of my head. I'd have to look them up. So I can do that and maybe share with the Peer Connect team and they can share that out or however that might work. But I also like what you mentioned about being preemptive with that, right? And having this presentation at different stages of peer support work and programming. I think touchstones to keep reflecting back is so critical, just like it is to build our skills as we go along. Having these touch points to reflect back is really important. It's a bit of a performance evaluation for ourselves without judgment and without shame of what our roles now look like. Yeah.
Perhaps it may take away some of the fear of retirement the year before. God, I'm leaving. I left on my own terms and it was good. But even though when I left, I still felt like I wasn't part of the team anymore.
Right. Yeah. And so what you're speaking to just reminds me of that sense of belonging, right? That sense of community and connection to that is so critical. And that's why I know for me, and I'm sure many others, being part of a peer support team feels good because there's that sense of connection, belonging, purpose. So what you're speaking to is really interesting of how that anticipatory, maybe anxiety or grief or whatever, of knowing we might be getting ready to step away from that. And how do we ensure that we're protected in that? I love that you brought that forward. Thanks, Leo.
Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to meet you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
We have a question from Kathy, just on that line though, of the retirees. I know some of the groups, I don't know if anyone here, any of our Peer Connect clients are in this category, but we do have some that have set up retired peer support teams and actually use the Peer Connect system to help facilitate that. So that could be something that a group may want to look at as well. But then I think probably setting boundaries may even be as or more important there, because now you're totally volunteer or off time. But Kathy's question here in the chat, can you speak about some tips or strategies on how to change a boundary with someone? I know that setting them can feel hard enough, but changing them can feel even tougher.
Yeah. Kathy, yes, that is true. I will validate that for you 10 times over. Changing a boundary with someone is hard. It can be an uncomfortable conversation. It can feel anxiety inducing, all of the things. What I've done when I've had to do it, I can think of a few situations. I've reflected on it on my own and had to almost talk myself into the fact that I have a right to adjust this because my well-being is being impacted. I also don't need to over-explain myself or justify my needs to this peer, even if they push on it, right? Because you may be supporting a peer where there's a dependency issue like that's being created or an attachment that's been created. I've definitely been in those situations. So my tip on that is to really reflect on what it is you need and sometimes even practice how you're going to say it, while also managing our expectations and preparing ourselves for, okay, if they push back because you have a sense of who they are and how they may respond, standing strong in your needs. And I've always gone back to, I need to acknowledge that I'm not doing so well right now, and I actually need to adjust whatever it might be, whether it's your time or what you're talking about. You don't have to give all the dirty details. You can just stand strong in that my well-being is being impacted. I really have to pay attention to that so I can even continue to show up in these conversations, and communicating that you're doing it from a place of care, because if you don't adjust this, it could create harm for the peer and yourself, and that's not something you want to do. So I really try and go back to being authentic and genuine. Uh, and I've expressed it and had a situation that it's been pushed on, and there was a high emotional reaction from the peer, which was hard for me to take on and not want to just say, oh, it's fine, I don't need to. But I knew if I did that, I was no longer going to be present for them. My resentment was building, my exhaustion was building. So I just kept coming back to, I really need this for me, and my well-being. And again, it's that sense of role modeling. So that would be a bit of some insight into how I've done it. And I think, again, I'm not going to lie, these conversations are hard and they can be taxing in themselves, but not having them ends up being harder in the long run. So it's a good practice of being in that space of discomfort, and also just remembering you don't need to share more than you feel comfortable with. And we don't have to make it specifically about them. Just keep the focus on you, right? We're not going to say, well, because of this, I need to do this. Just keep the focus on you and remain in that calm and kind, compassionate demeanor as we're communicating it. And we're doing the best we can. You may have someone who's disappointed, upset, angry. We can't control that. So I also have to remind myself of that. I can't control other people's reactions and emotions. I just have to stay true to what feels good for me and do my best to communicate it in a kind way. I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Kathy.
Okay, so last chance for any questions. While we are chatting here, I believe we do have our next webinar. If you just want to mark it in your calendar, some info will be going out. That'll be July 29th on Zoom, kind of same time, same place. So you can pre-register for that. Thank you, everyone who did attend today. And I know we had a lot of people that registered but couldn't attend, so we'll do that follow-up. Just in terms of our quick pitch, so First Response Mental Health, we do make the Peer Connect system. I know a lot of you in the chat or in the meeting today use the system. If you're curious to learn more about it and how it kind of helps you with a lot of the things that Hayley talked about today, whether that's kind of monitoring your peer team for burnout, allowing your peers to set their own kind of boundaries in a systemic way, so not maybe even heading off some of these difficult conversations before they get to that place. Just let us know. We'll have information in the follow-up package as well on how to meet with us. But we did get, John snuck in a last minute question, which is awesome. We still have a couple minutes. So any advice on how to choose between peer support groups, work versus non-work groups? That's a great question.
Can I ask for a bit more clarification on that question, John? Are you asking in terms of seeking out a peer support group for yourself or for others? I'm not quite sure I fully understand. If it's easier to speak to it, definitely feel welcome to. Full-time employer versus volunteer. Any advice on how to choose between peer support groups? In terms of working
Hi.
as a... Yeah, hi.
Sorry, hello?
Yes, go ahead, John.
Sorry, I just figured to speak quicker and easier. Yeah, so a volunteer group outside of your full-time employee, if there's an internal peer support group at your employer, but you have already considered volunteering for an organization outside of your employer, is there pros or benefits, or is there, I mean, obviously the conflict of interest would be there, but what would be better suited to I guess, which would be more beneficial to provide help and support is kind of the challenge that I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you for speaking to it. I think that's really individual. I mean, a lot of folks feel like they want to be part of their workplace peer program because that feels good, the sense of involvement, the sense of supporting their their colleagues, if they can navigate conflict of interest, should they show up. But for some folks, that feels very scary to be a peer supporter at work, right? We have to be realistic. There still is stigma and shame that exists around opening up about our mental well-being at work. This is still a reality. And for some of us, that can feel terrifying, or just not safe for whatever reason. So it could be that it feels better for us to engage in peer support outside of that community. And there's no right or wrong answer. I think this is really personal. And if that's something you're navigating right now, I would definitely encourage you to, if you're involved in the volunteer one and that's landing in and feeling good and is something that energizes you, that's a great sign. But if it's feeling like a disconnect or whatever, pay attention to that. So I don't think there's a right or wrong or what's better and what's worse. But I love that you brought this question forward, because there might be other folks navigating that too, in terms of what feels like a safer environment to step into this work, or even capacity wise. Maybe it's a little less strain on time and energy in one versus the other. That's the other thing that could be looked at. So I know it's not a okay. Yeah, thank you. I know it might not be the checklist answer, but yeah, great question.
So we have another question from Jody, and I realize some people will probably have to scoot off to other meetings, but we can keep this open as long as the questions are going. So Jody asked, can you speak more to the power dynamics and how you handle management accessing or providing peer support in relation to employees that would be their subordinates?
Yes. Okay, so if I'm delivering peer support training, when I deliver peer support training, it's grounded in the national guidelines here in Canada, so created by the Mental Health Commission of Canada and peer supporters years ago. If I were to answer from the pure peer support lens, I would suggest that if you are wearing two hats as a manager and a peer supporter, and one of your direct staff is looking to be matched with a peer supporter, it may not be in your best interest to be both their manager and formal peer supporter. That may create barriers for both of you in terms of disclosure, in terms of safety. All of these things become apparent because if you're a peer looking to chat about maybe you're actively using substances, right? Do you want to be sharing that with your manager where now there's like an HR hat coming to play? It can get really messy. So my go-to or my fallback is always to avoid that and try and keep those separate, because you can use your peer support principals as their manager, but that doesn't mean you also have to be their formally matched peer supporter, right? Like, so the two can be separated but coexist. It may be more appropriate that they have someone where there isn't that power dynamic to have as their formally matched peer supporter. And providing peer support in relation to employees, that would be, yeah, I think the same goes for not just manager to employee, but friend to friend too. Maybe you have a colleague you're quite close with and you have a friendship. They learn you're a peer supporter. They want you to be their peer supporter. You've got to weigh the pros and cons of that. Again, the suggestion would be it might create blurriness in the lines and create a peer drift where you're ending up doing more things that are on the friend side versus the peer support side. And we really have to pay attention to, again, you can use your peer support skills in your friendship, but it may not be in the best interest to have both hats at play at once. Those would be my recommendations. Everybody's going to approach this differently. Some will feel there's no conflict of interest. I'm not going to stand here and say, don't do this, don't do that. But my suggestions would be, if you suspect a potential conflict, probably best to err on the side of caution, especially in workplace settings, especially with power dynamics at play when we're talking sensitive content and being vulnerable. Great question.
Perfect. Okay, with that, I guess we will close things up. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Look for that follow-up information in the email that you registered with. And thank you again, Hayley, for the great presentation. Really appreciate it. And I think the crowd that we had here today could get a lot out of it, as there are a lot of peer support coordinators and people involved. And yeah, and if you want Hayley to work with your group individually and talk about some of these issues of supporting your peer support team, just let her know. And Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.